We're ready to begin.
Great. So, good morning, everyone. Katie, am I on screen here?
Yes, you are, Joan.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm delighted. I'm Joan Mower. I'm the program committee co-chairman of the new PDCA, Public Diplomacy Council of America. I'm absolutely delighted to be talking with Marie Yovanovitch, Ambassador Yovanovitch. Most of people who have been around HST know Marie Yovanovitch as Masha. She's a personal friend of mine, so I'm going to take the liberty of calling her Masha. Masha might be one of the best known people in America right now, or even in places like Ghana, where I've recently been, and people saw her on television. She has had an amazing career. She was ambassador to Kyrgyzstan, to Armenia, to Ukraine, a graduate of Princeton. And she's written this fabulous book called Lessons from the Edge, a memoir. It's truly a page turner. And for those of us who have been in the Foreign Service, have worked at HST, have worked overseas, it's a primer. So it's a wonderful book. It's just fantastic. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about her book. We're going to talk about her time as ambassador to Ukraine, her involvement with public diplomacy throughout the years, although she's not publicly diplomacy code officer. She, as her book points out, was very involved with the press and with public diplomacy programs in a number of her posts. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Masha to talk about basically why she wrote the book. I think a lot of us know. What the reaction to the book has been, and really some other comments about what she'd like to talk about. And then we'll go to questions and over to you, Masha.
Well, Joan, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be with you and with everybody else in the audience. So I wrote the book because after my public testimony in Donald Trump's first impeachment, I got a lot of letters, thousands of letters from the American public thanking me for my service and asking about me, about my life, about my time as a Foreign Service officer, the challenges, the opportunities. Younger people asked, how do I join the Foreign Service? How do I become a diplomat? So, at that point, it was sort of, December of 2019. I knew that my career in the Foreign Service was probably over. And so I was going to retire, and I didn't have, a plan B. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book. And so that was the genesis, and it became this book, this memoir.
Masha, tell us what the reaction has been. Your book got a lot of publicity when it came out. You yourself got a lot of publicity. You talk in the book about being an introvert and someone, although you were ambassador in 3 posts, that you tend to be someone who's a little bit shy. And all of a sudden, you're in the public eye. And what does that feel like for you?
Yeah. So it's true. I'm a pretty intense introvert, like many people in the Foreign Service. And so, all the things that we do in terms of interacting, with our contacts, with large groups of people, with the public, with the media, can sometimes not be second nature which is probably inexplicable to somebody like you who is, an extrovert. But you kind of learn how to manage your nerves and your expectations. What's different about now is that before it wasn't about me personally. It was about the U.S. people, the American people, the U.S. government, our positions, our talking points, etc. And so you can hide behind that a little bit, as an introvert. But now, when I say something, it's my opinion. It's not the position of the U.S. government. Now, when people ask about things, and I wrote about a lot of personal things in the book, all of that is fair game. And so that's really different and sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. But here's the positive. the book has been generally very well received. And I'm thrilled with that reception. I mean, I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would be a New York Times bestselling author, but there you have it.
Wow. Wow. That's, it's a great story. And I'm just going to jump right into it, which is basically President Trump firing you after a very concerted disinformation campaign against you, led in part by the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, along with some of his cohorts, and some unknown players, people who advised Pete Sessions, who was a congressman. Anyway, there was a disinformation campaign against you. And at the Public Diplomacy Council, PDCA of America, we are very, it's one of our topics. We've had a lot of seminars, a lot of discussions on disinformation. Give us your thoughts on being the target of disinformation and how we might, as Americans, as American government officials, deal with this. I mean, you were the personal target of disinformation.
Yeah. So, this has happened to me overseas, but it's been, foreign actors, foreign press that has, put out, or foreign governments that has put out disinformation about me, and then it gets picked up, and it's extremely hard to combat, honestly. And I wish I could tell this audience something they don't know about how to push back on it, because I think this is one of the challenges, both domestically and overseas for the United States. How do we handle this? But in my case, I'd seen it overseas, but it was always foreign actors that were doing this. What was different about this one was that the smear campaign was kind of a coordinated action between the corrupt the prosecutor general, who's like our attorney general, Lutsenko, and the Giuliani team. They were working together to create this campaign alleging, all sorts of things that I had done or the embassy had done, which were false. And they succeeded ultimately through this concerted campaign in removing me from Ukraine. And so that was what was different, that it was those close to my own government that were in on this, and working on behalf of the President of the United States, who was using his office for his personal and political gain, not for, in this instance, not for the American people, which is what he should be doing. So I had seen that, presidents, other senior leaders using their office for personal gain, but I never expected to see that in the United States from the President of the United States.
Yeah, you talk about, excuse me, I'm just going to make a house announcement. I kind of messed up at the beginning. If you've got questions for Masha, please put them in the Q&A box. We're already getting questions coming in. So I'm going to take the moderator's liberty and ask a couple of more questions. And then I seriously think I'm going to turn it over to the audience, because I've got a ton of other questions, but we've got a lot coming in already. So let me just ask you, Masha, in terms of Ukraine, one of the things that former President Trump has said is that if he had been president, Putin would never have invaded Ukraine. And I just would like you to sort of ground truth that sentence. I mean, you talk a lot about what happened in the Donbass when you were there, in Crimea when you were there. So just if you could elaborate on your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing I'd say is, it's a hypothetical. And Joan, we've both been trained that you never answer a hypothetical question. But now, since I'm on my own, I'll go for it. I would just say one thing at the outset. If you agree with the former President Trump's statement, it doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine or the free world would be better off. And so I'll go into that. So, going back to President Trump's term, I don't think that Putin's goals were any different then than they are now. He wanted to control Ukraine. I don't think at the time, I certainly didn't understand that he actually physically wanted to control all of Ukraine and bring it back into, the folds of Mother Russia. I thought that destabilizing Ukraine with the war in the East was enough, and disinformation campaigns and the cyber attacks that also incidentally caused a lot of economic damage in other countries as well, the assassinations. I thought all of that was enough for Russia, but as we see, it wasn't. But he definitely wanted to destabilize Ukraine. And the other thing that Putin didn't like was, NATO, the EU, the strength of those alliances, those organizations, and the relationship with the United States. And he made no bones about, his dislike of NATO, although, much of it grounded on kind of, grievances that I don't think have any basis in fact, mythology, disinformation. That NATO was an aggressive organization rather than the defensive pact we know it is. So those were his two goals, Ukraine and weakening NATO. And so let's look at what President Trump was doing during his administration. He was a critic, not to say an opponent of NATO. He felt NATO was taking advantage of the United States, and he took every opportunity not only to voice that behind closed doors, but also publicly. He lambasted our closest allies publicly. I think many were wondering whether NATO would be able to withstand, not only the first 4 years of Trump, but the next 4 years of Trump. And we have people, senior advisors to Trump, like John Bolton, telling us that had Trump won, he would have taken the United States out of NATO. And, that would have probably been the death knell of NATO, because over the last 70 plus years, NATO has really relied on US leadership, just as it is today under President Biden. And I think one of the things we often forget is that President Putin has strategic patience. He invaded Georgia in 2008, took two chunks of Georgia, and then waited a while. And then in 2014, he went into Ukraine, illegally annexed Crimea, started the war in the Donbass. I think he was stopped where, at the in the line of control that existed on February 23rd because of sanctions. But it wasn't enough. He kept that hot war going in the middle of Europe. He, 2 to 3 Ukrainians, both soldiers and civilians, died every week. But it was destabilizing. And he kept that going for 8 weeks, sometimes turning it up, sometimes turning it down. I'm sorry, I said 8 weeks, 8 years to 2022. And then he launched this war. So we can see that he's got strategic patience in pursuit of his goals. And so what did he do about Ukraine during Trump's administration? The war continued. Trump gets credit for the first shipment of javelins to Ukraine, which the Obama administration did not do. We all know what happened with the second shipment of javelins, since it featured in the Perfect Call. So that was also delayed, but was finally sent over. But the damage was done. That Trump was signaling, to Ukraine that he wasn't a stalwart partner for Ukraine, and the world knew it as well. Certainly, President Putin did. The other thing I'd point out is that during the Trump administration, the Russians were trying to build a bridge across the Kerch Straits, which is that body of water that connects the Azov Sea to the Black Sea. And they were trying to gain control of the Azov Sea, which is completely encircled by Russia on the one side and Ukraine on the other. And they were building a bridge. They successfully completed that bridge. And then incrementally, they started doing certain things that would give them control over the passageway into and out of the Azov Sea. So fast forward to November of 2018, and the Russians expanded the war in Ukraine to the naval domain for the first time ever, and publicly they admitted it. They seized 3 Ukrainian vessels along, state vessels, warships, along with 24 sailors in November 2018. This happened on a Sunday, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. But even on Sundays, the U.S. government is working. John Bolton relates that the president didn't want us to issue a statement condemning the Russians, didn't even want us to issue a statement urging the Russians to let the vessels go. So what happened was that the Russians noted this, and they might not have done anything if we had issued a statement. But in the absence of any kind of reaction, what happened is the Russians towed the Ukrainian vessels into Russian waters, into Russian ports, and imprisoned the Ukrainian sailors. A clear act of war. And we did nothing for about 24 hours, perhaps a little bit more, until Nikki Haley condemned this, going well beyond her approved talking points to condemn this. And so then in early December, there had been an agreement. So everybody was trying to, send a signal to the Russians that this is not okay. They cannot do this again. They need to, let the vessels and the sailors go, but they also cannot do this again. And so it was agreed, it was approved by the White House, that we would send naval vessels, U.S. naval vessels, for ship visits and in the Black Sea. We do this all the time. It's a way of signaling that we have right of passage, that there is right of passage, not just for U.S. vessels, but for all vessels. That's important, freedom of the seas, just for regular transport, but also for commercial purposes, right? Because there are a lot of commercial vessels, as we know now, that are stuck in the Black Sea because the Russians are bottling up the Black Sea and some of the ports there. So we do this periodically, and we were doing it then to send that signal to the Russians. And after it was announced, President Trump canceled it because he didn't want Putin to be angry. So, if you're getting everything you need from the President of the United States, why use the instrument of war? And we know that Putin is a patient man. And I think he was just waiting to see how much more he was going to get. And he was working, his friendship with the President of the United States, and it was going pretty well. And then, of course, Trump lost the election, and Joe Biden came into office, which was a different story for President Putin.
I've read that whole scenario with the Black Sea and the ships. It was amazing. Masha, the questions are coming in fast and furious, and I'm actually going to go first to my Greta Morris, who's also an ambassador, former ambassador, and also works on the program committee with me. And she has a very simple question. Thanks for your inspiring career. What are your lessons from the edge for members of the Foreign Service, and the American people? Give us your 3 lessons from the edge.
Well, I think really the most important thing for me was that I wanted the book to be sort of relatable, not just for foreign policy wonks like all of us, but to people in America. And so that's why I ended up making it a memoir. And, there are lots of stories in this memoir. And what I hoped is that through these stories, people in America would understand what diplomacy is, the sorts of things, the many varied things we all do for the American people, and why it's important. Because I think that often first of all, there's that trope that, we all lead incredibly glamorous lives. And I think my book puts that to rest, starting with my first tour in Mogadishu, Somalia. But I think also, why our work is important to Americans, even if we are conducting it far, far away.
Great. As you know, this is a public diplomacy group. So I'm going to pivot to Mike Korf, who also works closely with us and edits our newsletter. And his question is, at your 3 posts as ambassador, were you served ably by your public diplomacy counselors?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. Obviously, everybody's very different. And over time, things changed in the way we conducted public diplomacy. So I started as ambassador, I started in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And, we weren't tweeting or anything like that. By the time I got to Ukraine, we were tweeting and, using social media, sometimes in very innovative ways. So yes, I would say that the public diplomacy teams were pretty terrific. And especially in Ukraine, because we had a very, very large team of Americans and a very capable team of Ukrainians who really understood social media and other platforms in ways to reach our target audiences. I mean, for example, we had something called America House, which was, the old consular section in the middle of town that was converted into a public diplomacy platform. Tremendously expensive, but very, very worthwhile in terms of its, our ability to be able to reach people both in person with many events there, as well as, live streaming events and sort of amplifying it in other ways as well.
I'm just going to jump in myself and just, make a little ad for VOA here, because VOA and RFE-RL have actually had huge audiences in Ukraine. And we've currently, as maybe people know, there's one channel that the news organizations in Ukraine have all joined together to have one stream. And we were actually on that stream. And one of the things we did was hire Masha talks about the Gongadze murder, which was the famous journalist whose body was found floating headless in the river. And his widow, of course, has worked for VOA for a number of years and has really driven up our audiences and become a very influential voice for the United States. She's obviously now a US citizen. So can you tell us a little bit more in detail, Masha, about the initiatives? And I'm also going to pivot to another question, which comes from Joel Fishman, who is our co-president at the PDCA. And he asks, if we assume that Ukraine will win in some way the war, what are the types of things that the U.S. government should be doing in the post-war environment in Ukraine in the public diplomacy front and other issues? Infrastructure, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So initiatives that we had in Ukraine?
Well, 2 things. Number one, what are the things that we had that you thought were effective as when you were the ambassador? You talk a lot about America House in your book. You talk about hosting the election parties there, which was cool. You also talked about I think it was America House, the event which you were summoned by then DG Carol Perez. I think you had an event there to honor Ukrainian's Woman of the Year, who happened to be a journalist. I don't know if it was at America House, but again, that was a public diplomacy event, obviously focusing on women, women's achievements, media. What are sort of the very effective programs you had in Ukraine or in Kyrgyzstan or Armenia, for that matter? And what do you think we should do in Ukraine should they win the war?
Yeah. So, I'm not sure that we did, probably my team is going to kill me, but I'm not sure that we did anything different than we do in other countries. We just did a lot more of it because of, we had a large team, we had a lot of resources, and there was a great need and a very willing and open audience. So we did a lot, right in Ukraine, but we also, we had a lot of libraries that were like little outposts, little corners in libraries and in universities that that were little flagships for American education, American resource centers. There were events that were hosted there, and they were real, beacons for the communities in various different, cities around Ukraine, so that people didn't have to travel all the way to Kyiv to look at, some resource. They had them, closer in. So that was really, I thought, quite positive. We also, the war in the East, the war in, there was no longer fighting in Crimea, but the fact that it was illegally annexed created real challenges. And so, the State Department set up various ways of reaching those audiences through, I think it's called Real Times. And correct me if I'm wrong on the name of it, but it was not only in English or Ukrainian, but also in Russian, so that people in Crimea and in the east of Ukraine, many people only speak Russian, and so reaching people where they are with real information about the situation, but also softer news as well. I thought that was critically important. And, the last thing I would say is, this is not new, but I think it's the best investment we ever make are the exchange programs. I've just seen it over the years where you send somebody for a week to the United States, you send a high school student for a year to the United States, you send professionals, for professional education in the United States. It makes a huge difference because they come back and they may not agree with everything that we do. They may not agree with anything that we do, but they have a little bit of an insight into the United States. And I think, it's even with people that are, quite, shall we say, recalcitrant about our messages in the United States, it opens a window to being able to have the kinds of discussions that we need to have with leaders in other countries. And so, I think the criticism of some is that it takes, 30 years from when you send, a student to the United States to that person being, the Speaker of the Parliament or the President or the Prime Minister. That may be true. But it's also true that those people, those leaders, they have influence all the way along. They're student leaders, and then they're leading in their communities, and then they're leading in other areas, and they have influence, and that's important for us. And it's important for us that we have those interlocutors to share with us what's going on, what their thoughts are, but for us also to share our thoughts. And, when I think about it, so there's, it sometimes seems to me that, when we have new weapon systems coming on, 30 years is nothing. I'm thinking about the F-35, billions of dollars worth of overruns of expenses, nothing. We keep on going. And then I think about the exchanges where, okay, so maybe that takes 30 years too, but it's, a fraction of the cost, millions maybe. And I think the bang for the buck that we get from the exchanges is huge and perhaps comparable to what we get from some of our weapon systems. And so I think we need to invest in public diplomacy, particularly in exchanges. It's been worthwhile through the Cold War years and beyond.
Great. We've got a lot of fans out here in the Q&A box, Masha. So I'm going to wrap up, put two together. One is from Morris Jacobs, who's a famous public affairs counselor. And he asked, number one, I'm going to put these together. He asked, number one, will you come back to the Foreign Service? That's number one. Number two is from Catherine Brown, who is, plays a huge role in our public diplomacy, running a lot of the television specials. And she wants to know, have you considered a defamation lawsuit? And if not, why not? And also, she also sort of weighs in, would you consider coming back in some kind of role?
Well, that's really nice that people are asking these questions. I think that I had a great career for 33 years, and I think I made my contributions to the Foreign Service in when I was inside the Foreign Service. And I think now, it's time. It's time for other people to come up and do their part. But what I'd say is that I think I can continue to contribute in important ways outside of the Foreign Service as well, and am eager to explore ways that I can do that. I think there's a robust discussion now about how can we reform the Foreign Service, how can we reform the State Department. I think that's an important discussion, and I think it's important to start moving forward in terms of implementing some of the recommendations.
Well, I'm going to just pivot right there to Bruce Gregory, again, someone who's legendary in the public diplomacy world. And his question is, what are your suggestions for reforming the Foreign Service?
Yeah, so, I can't say I have original ideas because I really don't. But I do, I thought that the Belfer Center out of Harvard, I thought that report that came out about a year ago, I think it was, and the continuing working group on that is actually kind of on the right path. I think, so I think it's important that we look hard at our personnel policies, because the State Department is still, it seems to me, governed by the expectations of American society back in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. The last legislation was in 1980. And we know we reflect America. It's no longer a male Foreign Service officer with a wife who probably doesn't work, and who is bringing up the kids, and who is, endlessly supportive, even getting her own evaluation, even though she's not getting paid by the U.S. government. So, that era is past, but we have a lot of, hangover from that era. And I think we need to look at it. We need to look at the sorts of things that make sense for the kind of service we are now, where there are a lot of tandem couples, there are a lot of singles of one kind or another with children. These families need support. And how do we do that? And how do we make it possible for people that have a full plate at home as well as a full plate at work to continue to do all those things, but to continue to develop professionally and not put their careers on ice because they're worried that if they're DCM, they throw their hat in the ring to become DCM or ambassador, that they won't be able to manage because they have responsibilities at home. And you won't be surprised to know that most of the conversations I've had along these lines, not exclusively, but most of the conversations I've had along these lines is with other women who are concerned that they're the main stay at home, and they're worried that they can't take on additional responsibilities at this point. And how can we make it possible for people to do that? I think that's really important. So that's one thing. I think, on the substance side, I think we need to do a really deep dive into what the challenges are, not just of 2022, but of 2024, 2032, 2052. What do we see coming down the pike? And, what are the tools that we have? What are the tools that we need to address these challenges? And what is the proper role of the State Department in all of these things? I mean, sometimes I feel the State Department is, the embassy is just a platform for everybody else doing stuff, and we're one big, kind of management center for everybody else. And I think we need to solidify what the State Department role is, and how we can, and in my view, no surprise, I think we should have the leadership role in terms of setting foreign policy, obviously working with the NSC and with other agencies. And I think, this needs to be a review, not just at the State Department with a strong State Department champion that, starts with the Secretary of State, but we need champions on the Hill who are ready to push for this, because that's what it's going to take. Because, the thinking work obviously needs a lot of buy-in from a lot of different principals, but it would also require resources. And again, there's a role there for the Hill. The final thing I would say on this is that I think that we need to think hard about how we tell America's story, because while just take the Putin's war in Ukraine, while I think our message is out there and strong and is reaching a receptive audience in the West. That is not true, more broadly. I mean, I think there's some pushback, some of it because of, the Iraq War or, pick your foreign policy issue with the United States. And so how do we get traction on our foreign policy priorities, on how do we share with people what the United States is all about in a way that meets people where they are? I think we need to really think hard about that and resource it. And the last thing I'd say is I think we need to do a better job of telling Americans what diplomats do, what diplomacy is, and why it's important, and why it deserves to be supported by the American people. I mean, the CIA and DOD do an excellent job of this. In fact, they even have offices in Hollywood so that, they're available, they have people there available to share information, expertise with regard to scripts and things like that. And, we're the ones who are depicted on screen as, Ambassador No, or, the consular officer who's like refusing to allow, some deserving person a visa to go to the United States. I mean, our image is not of, much as it pains me to say this, but it isn't always an image of, we are the front line of defense for America, that we are all about promoting America's security, America's prosperity, and America's freedom, because that's what we do in many different ways all around the world. And I think we need to figure out how that is a message that Americans understand, so that they will support us, so that they will resource us, so that we can do a better job.
Yeah, that was very articulate. And it actually goes right to a question that Adam Footlick has, which is basically his question is, with all of the disinformation challenges we face in the United States, with, the shootings, God forbid, yesterday, some of the other issues that are going on, can the United States credibly promote democracy, continue to, and how do we do that? I think you've talked a little bit about it, but what are some of the specifics that we could actually, can we do it, and how do we do it?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it depends on the country that one is in, your host country, where your host country is in terms of its politics, its governance, the kind of government it has, and where the people are. I mean, that makes a huge difference, because you can't plant a seed in a dry bed, so to speak. So timing is important, very important, and who you're dealing with is important. I mean, is there a reformer leader who is willing to take risks to move his country forward, even if it means that he or she loses power in the next election? That's not true everywhere in the world. Isn't even true, sometimes in our country. So I think, timing is important, who you're dealing with is important. And just to get to the nub of the question, my own view is, yeah, the US still has an important voice on democracy and governance. When we help other countries move forward in these ways, first of all, at least in my experience, it's been because those countries asked us to help them. It doesn't mean that the leaders knew what they were in for. It doesn't mean that they liked the reforms that they agreed to up front. It doesn't mean that there wasn't resistance along the way. But it does mean that, you have partnerships in those countries with the government or with civil society organizations, et cetera. And I think the other thing is, I think we need to tell people and understand ourselves that while we certainly do have challenges in the United States, that have become very apparent over the last several years. We do this not because we think we're perfect, because we're not, but because we think it's important and that we need to do work in our own country. And we think it's important for other countries as well. And that's why we are helping them. And I think, honestly, we need to be humble about it. We don't have all the answers. That's very clear. And, sometimes I think, other countries may have something to teach us. I mean, when I was writing the book, I was realizing that, one of the things that I was concerned about, that we were concerned about in 2019, when the Ukrainians had presidential elections, was that President Poroshenko would not accept the results of the presidential elections. It was very clear to us that, the outsider, the protest vote guy, Zelensky, was going to win. And we were concerned that Poroshenko, who could, exercise every lever of power if he wanted to, wouldn't accept the results. And as it turns out, the Ukrainians did a better job in terms of a peaceful and smooth transfer of power than we did here in the United States. So, I think we need to be a little bit humble as we, go through our journey, but also help other countries with theirs.
We have two kind of buckets of questions. One focuses specifically on the Ukraine and one on the corruption issue. I'm going to flip to the corruption issue. Ambassador Cynthia Eford asks, how do you balance fighting corruption versus our geopolitical interests? And Bill James asks how you found the corruption in Ukraine, going from DCM to a number of years later, a decade later, being the ambassador.
So in terms of, balancing, everything we do, I don't need to tell this audience that everything we do is a balance, and it kind of depends on the country that you're in. I mean, not to dodge the question, but it's we need to be able to do two things at once. Sometimes we do it less well than others. I would say that in a country like Kyrgyzstan, we overemphasized, our security interests to the detriment of, governance and anti-corruption interests. So, it's always a balance. You never feel, at least I never felt, that we were getting it quite right. And, here's the other thing, going back to what is the role of the State Department, what is the role of the ambassador and the embassy? You have a number of different agencies that are all competing, for resources and what is going to be the loudest message in the particular country that you're in. And so harmonizing that in a way that makes sense for your entire country team, I think is something only an ambassador can do, only the State Department can do. And I think it's extremely important, but it's really hard to do. And I wish I had, like, I don't know, the tablets from Moses or something on how to do this. But I think it's what they pay us for. When we come into the Foreign Service, they tell us that good judgment, communication skills, interpersonal skills, that these are the things that are really most important. And I think that's right. That, you can learn a language, you can learn, the substance of the political issue, you can learn regional studies. But, some of these other things, while you can get help along the way, I think perhaps are a little bit more innate, and we need to do everything we can to support people in training to really become the best at these various skills that they possibly could be. I've forgotten the other question.
Basically, you've answered them about corruption, and I kind of like to a number of people have questions about Ukraine. And Sherry Muller, who's our co-president, along with Peter Kovich, another someone who's been in the PD world for many, many decades. And they're both asking essentially the same, as is Greta Morris, by the way, the same question. What do you, in your crystal ball, see happening? Negotiation, as Macron has suggested. Um, what are we looking at? Giving up Donbass, letting the Russians take Donbass and Crimea? What is, if your crystal ball says anything, what does it say?
Yeah. So I remember the other question from Bill James, and I think it's an important one. What was, corruption in our policy like in when I was first in Ukraine, 2001 to 2004, and then what was it like when I came back in 2016? So here's the thing. As far as I know, we weren't really focused on anti-corruption activities in Ukraine the first time. It wasn't that Ukraine wasn't corrupt. All of the, countries of the former Soviet Union had that Soviet legacy of corruption, because corruption, as this audience knows, thrives when governments don't work, when they don't provide their countries, their citizens with services, when people have to give bribes to to get medical care, when they have to give bribes to get the electricity turned on in the apartment they just moved into. People aren't going to wait around for 3 years for the electricity to get turned on. They're going to find, the guy who can do it and pay him a little bit extra to jump him up to the head of the queue. And of course they see, their petty corruption being reflected at the very top by the leaders who are stealing from the country, which is of course why the country isn't working and why there aren't services. So it's, kind of a self-licking ice cream cone there. But we weren't really talking about that. And in fact, the president was Kuchma at the time. And I think that if the ambassador had gone in and started talking about Kuchma and corruption and, the oligarchs, I think he would have gotten thrown out of the office. I can't even imagine that. Hopefully all of the things that we were doing were in some way increasing transparency and so forth. But that was certainly not, as far as I know, there was no goal that said eliminating or managing or somehow diminishing corruption. And so fast forward to 2014, when I was not in Ukraine, but there was the Revolution of Dignity, which was Revolution of Dignity. That's the Ukrainian way of saying, I want to be treated with dignity. I want the rule of law. I want to be able to, President Yanukovych, who is stealing from the country, should be held accountable. There should be one rule for him and one rule for me. I'm tired of paying bribes, just to go about my daily life. That's what the Revolution of Dignity was about. And so, all of a sudden, when Yanukovych was thrown out of the country, a new government came into place. There was a lot of impetus for anti-corruption reform from the people, from reformers in civil society and in the government. And so a lot of progress was made. And I was shocked when I arrived in 2016 that when I presented my credentials, which is a short formal meeting, President Poroshenko raised corruption in Ukraine, because this was something that, the people of his country were all in on and we were supporting. So there was a real shift in how we looked at this, and, in our understanding that corruption basically undermined everything else in the country and also undermined our relationship with those countries. So, so now I've forgotten the next question.
Well, the next question is broadly, what do you see
in
happening?
Ukraine? Yeah. So right now, so the short answer is I don't know. But I think that it's as Chairman Milley says, there is a grinding war going on in the East and the South, and it is. It's not exactly clear what is going to happen. And so things are becoming less, I think, predictable. I think we had thought that there would be, this big tank battle, and there is some of that. Obviously a lot of Russian equipment is being destroyed, and it's not like they have backup coming from China, the way Ukraine has backup coming, additional equipment flows coming from the United States and other countries, which is why it's so important that we keep on supporting Ukraine with military, with military equipment. I think, there's a big push right now in certain circles in Europe to move forward with negotiations. I haven't read Kissinger's speech yet, but I understand that yesterday at Davos, he was talking about essentially, really pressuring, if not forcing, Ukraine to give up territory to allow for some sort of a peace settlement. My very strong view is that we kind of tried that before. Back in 2014, we counseled the Ukrainians pretty strongly not to fight back in Crimea because they couldn't win. It would just make Putin angrier. Do any of these arguments sound familiar? And so, Putin grabbed Crimea in, less than a month. And then he moved on to Donbass. So I think, and then, the French and the Germans participated in peace negotiations with the Ukrainians and the Russians. And again, it was, we need to stop the killing. We need to stop the bloodshed. These are all very, valid concerns and laudatory goals. And, I've got friends there too. And, I worry about them every single day. But at the end of the day, it has to be Ukrainians who are doing the fighting, who are doing the dying, who decide whether they are ready for peace negotiations, whether they are ready for any concessions. And right now, they're not. After Bucha, after Mariupol, after countless other towns that we don't know the names of, where the Russians have not only fought soldiers, they have, tortured and killed civilians. I think the Ukrainians I know, the Ukrainians that I talk to, are pretty much as one that they want those deaths to count for something, and they want to, to push Russia out, and they believe that if there is, some sort of a ceasefire without a settlement, or a ceasefire with an insufficiently strong settlement, as was the case back in 2014, 2015 with the two Minsk Accords that the Germans and the French kind of forced Poroshenko to sign, that Russia is just going to wait, just going to regroup, and just going to reinvade. Russia, as we've seen, has strategic patience. And, maybe not next year, maybe in another 8 years. But Russia will not be done with Ukraine unless Ukraine prevails in this kind of in this war, and I believe that to be true. So I'm very sympathetic, obviously, to the Ukrainians, but I just don't think that forcing Ukraine to concessions. First of all, it's a democracy, and I don't think the people will accept it, even if the leadership does. But secondly, I think that Russia will regroup, use the time, and come back for more, because that's the pattern that we've seen. And we even know what Putin wants. We know he wants all of Ukraine. He told us on the eve of the war he's got his eye on other countries further west. And he's told us repeatedly over the years that the rules-based international system that was established after World War II doesn't really work for him, and he wants to destroy it. And this is his way of doing it, where might makes right. Littler countries need to accept it, and he's going to do what he wants. That is, a bad signal, I think, to other autocrats around the world who are watching this very closely, and it makes our world, the U.S. Included, less secure, less prosperous, and less free.
That's great, Masha. I mean, you're such a honest broker, and now that you're out of government, you can really say what you think, which is great. We're really running out of time, and I wanted to leave the last question to our younger, to Katie and Marcy and our younger people who are involved with PDCA. We have a strong mentorship project, and we feel very strongly about supporting younger people. And so the last question comes from them. What's your advice to young professionals who were in the Foreign Service or going into the Foreign Service? What's your number one piece of advice?
Work hard, do a good job, and have fun along the way. I can't tell you how many people are, so focused on how do I become ambassador, when what they need to be focused on is how do I do a really, really good job right now. I think, I understand, being impatient, and I understand ambition and everything else, but the way to succeed, is to do a really good job in the here and now, and the rest will sort itself out. Joan, you're muted.
Sorry, Joan, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuting myself. I'm sorry. I'm going to turn it over to you, Katie. This has been fabulous. Masha is smart, honest, and just a great person. And Michael Korth wants you to be the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it, Ambassador Yovanovitch, especially your last words of wisdom and of advice. I think we've all here today learned so much from you. Personally, I can't wait to read your book, and I'm sure that it is a sentiment shared by many in the audience. So to wrap up, I'd love to just introduce another upcoming event coming up on June 6th with the Public Diplomacy Council of America. This is going to be our next First Monday Forum, organized by our colleagues at USC in the Annenberg School over there. Nick Cull is going to be working with George Stevens Jr. on an event titled My Place in the Sun, Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood in Washington. This should be a really interesting and exciting discussion, as Mr. Stevens Jr. was the son of a legendary Hollywood producer. He also worked as an assistant film producer before Edward R. Murrow recruited him to join the motion picture service at the USIA in the early 1960s. He played a crucial role in elevating filmmaking at USIA and making motion pictures part of the public diplomacy playbook, which is actually something that Ambassador Yovanovitch talked about earlier today in her remarks about how we can tell our story of America to the world. So to continue that discussion, please join us on June 6th at 12 p.m. And check out the latest edition of the Public Diplomacy Council of America's weekly update newsletter on more information on how to register for that event, as well as the instructions that I've just put into the chat to contact Hannah Fassold at fassold@usc.edu if you would like to RSVP for that. So hope to see many of you soon for more events with the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Many, many thanks again to Joan and Ambassador Yovanovitch. And we can sign off and say goodbye for now. Thank you very much.